Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today for today's live stream. I'm excited to jump into questions here soon. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Callie Werner, a licensed clinical social worker. I do private practice working with athletes with anxiety and OCD, and I also work at OCD Institute at Houston as a clinician here. And so very passionate about this work, excited to jump in, excited to have you all joining from different places. Please remember you can keep some questions going through the chat, and I'm just going to open up with a little bit of an intro. So this live stream is educational and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please work with your provider or contact a local clinician. You can use the IOCDF's online resource directory at iocdf.org-find-help to locate a trained clinician near you. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline, and if you're in crisis or you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911 or 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988. You can also access online at www.988lifeline.org. We want to create a safe space and be kind and respectful to everyone at the end of the day. We're all here to support each other. So a note that this is being broadcast on several social media platforms and is being recorded. So that being said, without further ado, I will go ahead and ask a few questions that we did not get to from last live stream, and then we'll jump into current questions because I see they're already coming in, which is super exciting. So first question is, can you discuss Ttic OCD? What if the rituals don't necessarily have an intrusive thought behind it, such as Ttic OCD? So great question. I think oftentimes Tourette's can be misconstrued as OCD, but usually with OCD, there is a habit or a fear of something bad happening if someone doesn't engage in the behavior or the quick, maybe something like touching the face or doing something along those lines. And sometimes when we engage in an OCD behavior, we can also get in a habit of doing a compulsion so long that maybe the fear isn't associated with it anymore, that we just automatically go to this behavior, right? So if you used to struggle with, for example, checking locks or stoves and appliances, it might become an automatic response for you to go in and engage in a double check with the stove. I know I still find myself to this day with my own OCD. I used to struggle so much with closing refrigerator doors, and I would tap and tap and tap. And sometimes I'll still do a double press, and there's no anxiety associated with it. But it's just this habit that I've built up that I do want to work on reducing and being mindful of that, almost body focused repetitive behavior that I'm engaging in, so that it no longer continues down that way. But I have to be very mindful of, I'm going to close the fridge now and need to walk away, because otherwise that habit can just come right back. It's a great question. How do you separate OCD shame and guilt from real shame and guilt? Yeah, I think emotional reasoning happens a lot with OCD. For example, someone might just wake up feeling anxious one day and not really know why. And then an OCD intrusive thought comes up that makes them feel like, well, this is why I am feeling guilty, because of, it must be this intrusive thought or this experience that I'm having. And so with OCD, we know most of the time that a thought is intrusive, right? It brings that initial, this is anxiety. And the part that makes the exposure so difficult is there's a part of your brain that's still saying, ooh, but what if this is an OCD, right? And that's what makes it so challenging to really engage in that exposure, because of that part that says, what if it isn't? And that's where our values come into play. Instead of risking that this could not be OCD and avoiding and engaging in compulsions the entire time, letting yourself acknowledge, yeah, I feel guilt. And I think this probably is from the OCD. I can't prove that with certainty, but I'm choosing to do the exposure anyways. So we'll go back to those questions, and I'm going to jump in. I love seeing everyone respond in the chat. Hi to all of you from all over. It looks like we have people Good to see you, Matt and Amy. So first question that I have on here is, let's see, the somatic symptoms of OCD, or the response that you can feel from a private area due to sexual intrusive thoughts can definitely take place. And we can attach extra meaning to that, right? So, let's use the example of a mother who is postpartum and she has a baby and is having a lot of sexual intrusive thoughts, and she's breastfeeding her baby. Well, it's not uncommon for there to be a sensation or a arousal that can happen when someone's breastfeeding. But what is frustrating about that situation is we can attach extra meaning to what that means, right? And so our goal in those situations is really not to attach that extra meaning. If we give a bunch of reassurance, we know what happens, right? If I say, well, okay, I know that this is part of science and this is definitely nothing to do with me being a bad person, well, then OCD is just going to say what if and send us in another cycle of rumination. So our goal is really to instead say, okay, interesting response from my body there, and choosing to move forward anyways, towards values. If we sit there and expect ourselves to move forward, it's not really going to happen. It's really about continuing to engage in your day, accepting that the anxiety is still there as well, right? So, yep, I see anxiety is back here in the back of my head and I wish that it would be gone. But if we sit there and wait for it to be gone before we do that next part of our day, we're going to be waiting a long time. So great question. I think that's an important one for us to talk about. Other questions. What can I do if I have overwhelming rumination about an obsession that might actually be real? The rumination is about my gender identity. Great question. So I think with this one, the really tricky part is that the more we try to prove if this is real or not real, there's this incredible video, I think by, is it Matt Freeman or Mike Freeman? He talks about false memories and OCD, and he uses a picture of a banana or a video of a banana and just keeps asking himself, is this really a banana? And it's a great representation of this. But I think the more we try to determine if it's real, the more confused we get. And so when we try to find out if an OCD response is real or meaningful, the more confused we get, what we need to do is work on getting our anxiety down, because when our anxiety comes down, the insight comes back and we can think a little bit more rationally and clearly. If we're trying to determine if something is real when we're feeling extremely anxious, it's almost like, have you ever gotten really frustrated with somebody and then sent an email and regretted sending it the next day? Well, that's why they say type out the email, but don't send it, because usually we're going to say something we regret, or we're speaking out of that heightened emotion. And when we have heightened emotions and we're making decisions, it's more irrational than rational. So I would say work on letting that answer be uncertain, trying to move forward and knowing that my favorite go-to life saying right now is the more certainty I try to get, the more uncertain I become. And so I think that is like a winning gold standard quote that we should, if we're struggling with OCD, all live by. Okay, so thanks for the birthday wishes. I love it. Yes, my birthday was last week and it was a lot of fun. We have Terry here that says, sometimes I suffer from religious OCD and scrupulosity. I believe in God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, but sometimes the thoughts get so bad it ruins my whole day, but I don't act on them. I pray in faith. And yeah, with scrupulosity, sometimes we feel like I need to engage in this behavior in order to, the praying over and over to make sure that nothing bad happens, or to make sure that I have God in my favor. And what's tricky about scrupulosity is our values get tied in with the OCD, right? So like we value praying, or you value engaging in these faith-based practices, but then the compulsion makes it also something that attacks those values that you probably wouldn't want to be engaging in at the time. And so what I always like to do is we want to get back to that baseline, right? Because right now, OCD, even if your values want you to pray, even if your values are driving you to grow stronger in your faith, if OCD is pushing that too, values get really murky, right? And so we need to get to a place where we are working on reducing compulsions, which might mean, okay, I'm going to skip a prayer today and I'm going to sit with the anxiety of that so that you get the choice again, so that you get in the driver's seat again. Because when anxiety is in the driver's seat, you're not making those decisions alone, right? You're making those decisions out of forced fear, which is really putting your focus on OCD, not putting your focus on faith. And so if one can actively choose, okay, I'm going to do these other things today instead of engage in this prayer, well, then we know that we're back in that driver's seat, able to kind of lean forward. So I hope that gives some hope to Terry, what you were saying. And when a loved one or a friend suffers with OCD, it can be really debilitating and challenging, especially if they might not want to get support right away. Oftentimes individuals will accommodate the OCD, right? Do whatever they can to help that person white knuckle and get to the next place, or engage in some of those compulsions. And I think pointing them in the right direction, just like all advocates do, right, is towards the appropriate level of care, appropriate treatment, even just some educational resources like the Peace of Mind website. One of my favorite places to send new clients to is Peace of Mind, where that list of subtypes is, because a lot of individuals, maybe they know they have a hand washing compulsion, but they didn't realize that they also struggle with magical thinking. And all of that content is right there, very easy to access, and can just clear up, help them realize they're not alone, but also get that process going to where they might be open to some therapy. And Matt said, what are your thoughts, Callie, with a client starting treatment? What would be a good starting structure for value-driven ERP for their journey towards recovery? I love that question. Yeah, I think it really does, first, I guess, depend on what the subtype is that they're experiencing. If they are, let's say, not really bought into treatment yet, I first would maybe do a cost benefit analysis of, okay, what are the costs of this OCD? Like, what's it taking away from your life that either it used to not take away, or that you don't want it to take away anymore, right? Like, where are we, if this OCD continues without treatment and continues to get worse, what else is it going to take away? So that we can create a different perspective, so that maybe there can be some open buy-in to starting to get some of that support. And so after that, though, I really do like to kind of just do a step-by-step. I think it's really important to educate anyone listening, especially if you haven't done any therapy before. A good ERP provider is not going to send you off to doing a level 10 exposure on your first day, right? Imagine if I had a client coming in who struggled with hand washing and wasn't opening doors and hadn't opened a door in 5 years. And I said on that first day of therapy, we're going to go open 10 different doors. Well, they would probably never come back to therapy again, right? That would be almost traumatizing for this individual. And so you have to kind of weave in this structure that is, yes, uncomfortable in the moment, but less uncomfortable than living a long life challenging OCD every single day, and working in at a rate that makes sense to the client, right? Some individuals prefer the intensive, where they come in and they engage in a week of intensive therapy and they move through exposures pretty quickly. And that works really well for some and not others. And so I also think, just to kind of add one more thing to that question, Matt, is getting to know the client is extremely important, because there isn't a one size fits all approach. Although there is an evidence-based treatment approach that we always want to keep in mind. All right, next question. When I meet a non-religious person, I start to get curious as to what the moral code they practice. Is this scrupulosity? That's a great question. Let's see. When I meet with another non-religious person, I think it has to do with, there's a difference between curiosity and feeling anxious or like you have to take action and do something, right? It's pretty normal to be curious about something. You can wonder what someone believes based off of what they're eating. And I think curiosity is a good thing, right? It's more so when I feel like I have to fix this, or I need to pray about this, or I need to do something because I'm feeling anxious to make this right. That would be more in line with that scrupulosity, right? Or really any compulsion, right? If we feel this anxiety and desire to, gosh, I need to do something right now to make myself feel better, more likely than not, that's coming from a place of OCD. And we want to do a little bit more sitting with the discomfort, right? Getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, so that we can get that part of our life back, or be present in the conversations. Imagine if someone is worried about what other people are saying, and if they're saying something wrong, or if they're engaging in a sin, because that can happen with scrupulosity. How much of that conversation are they actually missing out on by replaying everything that this individual is saying? Because I know that that's not a part of values either, or written in a faith practice. And so we want to be able to be present and try to engage with individuals and not let OCD take that away too. Great points here. Why can OCD convince you of anything, but you can't convince it back? So, OCD can be very convincing for sure. And I think that the way you convince it back, I think it is possible, but it just might not look, TK, like the trajectory that you're thinking of right now, right? Because if you argue with OCD and you say, gosh, I think that you're wrong, OCD. I wish that you wouldn't bother me. I think that I really didn't do anything wrong. Well, you're going to be playing tug of war with OCD all day long, right? I like to think of it as like it's a monster that wants a rise out of you. And so if you give it that rise, it's going to continue to push and push and push like a bully, right? And so the way that we actually convince it back is more of that approach that's like, yeah, there's that thought, right? If you have a scary thought, there's a bunch of different exposures individuals can do for it. They might make a rap out of this scary thought. They might make a rhyming word that goes with it. They might just respond with thanks, brain, for that thought, right? Because OCD is expecting you to go, or expecting you to squeeze your fist, or expecting you to get really sweaty and panicked. But if you start to change the behavior, even though the feeling is really heightened anxiety, then the feeling follows later, right? So we have to work on changing that initial reaction. Like, yeah, doesn't bother me, even though there's a part of your brain that's screaming, yes, this bothers me. But that's the first step in doing an exposure the right way, right? Because for so long, how many times when something's triggered you, have you actually said, oh, this is so triggering? Or have you actually said, I don't know what to do here? And what signal are we sending to the brain? We're sending the signal that this is bad, this is scary, when we really want it to be in that neutral middle ground place. Okay, next question. I have a hard time accepting uncertainty when it comes to themes that deal with identity. So themes that deal with identity, like, am I a good person or am I a bad person? I think, there's a little bit of truth to not wanting to believe that someone is a bad person, right? Like think about if someone struggles with sexual intrusive thoughts or has fear that they could be this horrible, terrible person. Sometimes people think that accepting uncertainty means that they have to accept that they are that person, that they are that murderer or individual that's doing all these horrible things wrong. And that's not what leaning into uncertainty is. Leaning into uncertainty is not accepting that you're a bad person, right? Because if we do that and we're struggling with OCD, what's more likely to happen is individuals going to get depressed, really struggle with moving forward with certain parts of their day. And so our goal is to kind of think about being in that middle zone of uncertainty if we go to the best case scenario of I'm an amazing person and I need to believe this wholeheartedly, well, OCD is going to be like, oh, but what if you forgot that you did that thing wrong? And then it's going to send you in another cycle. So I think it's so important to just remember that we're not asking you to sit with that worst case. Also, there's something to say about when someone struggles with guilt of certain intrusive thoughts, some self-compassion along the way. If someone's engaging in self-compassion over the topic, can kind of start to become a compulsion or a reassurance seeking behavior. So you want to make sure that you're doing that in therapy in a good controlled setting with an OCD provider. But yeah, I think OCD takes a lot of that self-worth and self-compassion away. And so it's important to sprinkle that into just at the right pace and to do it in a way where you're not trying to immediately relieve anxiety, right? Because every time we're trying to immediately relieve anxiety, what we're doing is we're sending that signal to the brain that that was bad or that was a difficult thought, and we're just engaging in that compulsion cycle. And I think, Tushar, for your example or your question about doing something for a friend that's suffering with OCD, on the Peace of Mind website specifically, there's a section for families and loved ones and caregivers, I think is what it's called. It might say for caregivers, but the content in there is actually really good for all individuals. And so I would definitely check that out. There's some great videos and paragraphs on there that can be super helpful. All right, so everyone talks about how important it is to work with the core fear, but I think it's important to work with the more superficial ones as well. Can you give an example of how to work with both? Yeah, so I really like that question. I think core fear work is, yes, absolutely important, because oftentimes you might see this with kids when you're doing therapy, and that they can just be doing these exposures, where I tell them, hey, you can touch the desk right here that's contaminated, or you can sit on the floor. But they're only doing exposures because maybe the provider said it's okay, right? Or they're getting a little bit of reassurance because it was on their hierarchy. Well, OCD, we all know, is very creative, right? So before we know it, it's going to get to a place where it comes up with something else that we didn't go over in therapy. And that's a great example of why core fear work is so important. Other thing that can happen if we don't do core fear work is OCD can morph. And if we're not really leaning into that core fear of I can handle uncertainty, then when it morphs, it's going to spin us in a cycle all over again, right? And so do we want to do in the moment ERP? Absolutely. That's living an ERP lifestyle, right? If I go drive down the road right now and I hit a bump, what we were just talking about is I don't want to just, I got to wait until I can figure out what my core fear is and lean into that. No, I want to do an in the moment exposure where I say, you know what, I've got to drive forward. I'm not going to go check on what that bump was. But core fear work would also be responding with, and I'm leaning into that middle ground. I'm not going to the worst case scenario because that's going to send me in a panic. I'm not going to the best case scenario because then I'm just going to get stuck reassuring in this loop next time I hit a speed bump, right? And so again, that middle ground is where things are really important. Kate says, I have a hard time accepting uncertainty when it comes to themes that, that's what I just answered. So I hope that was helpful, Kate, and please provide any other questions that you have along the way if I didn't fully clarify that one. What about the question of, you don't have this problem, you can't simply explain this to your friend. If you don't have this problem, you can't simply, yeah, that's a good, so here's another thing I wanted to talk about today. And I'm glad this comment was brought up, because I think it's important to know that sometimes when someone's experiencing OCD, it can almost become like a compulsion to feel like you need to tell a loved one everything that you're experiencing, because the pain is so great that someone deals with that it feels like, gosh, I just need them to fully understand what I'm going through. And so I'm going to tell them every thought that I'm experiencing until they get it. And what was just said there by Rockman is that, like, well, if they don't have OCD, they're not fully going to get it. And that's true. They're not. Even if they do have OCD, nobody's OCD is exactly the same as someone else's. And so they're still not fully going to get it. But the part that we get wrong is that if they don't fully get it, they can't be a great sense of support. And that's not the case, right? Like there's a lot of incredible clinicians out there that I know that don't have OCD, and they treat OCD very well. And I would trust anyone in my family, any loved ones, to go work with this provider. And maybe they don't fully get that individual's OCD, but they have the empathy and the coping skills to help them work through it. And so I think that's just, an important piece of information to take with you. And if you're someone that maybe struggles with, I need to get all of these hurts and pains off my chest, ask yourself if you're noticing a cycle with that, right? Like, are you getting it all off your chest and feeling better temporarily, and then something else happens and you feel like you need to share that information as well? And is that kind of perpetuating the cycle with you? Because what we want to do is really learn to recognize that we have the tools to independently work through some of these exposures when we get triggered. Because if we're constantly going to that individual and telling them each time, hey, this is really hard and this is the trigger that I just had, we're also sending a signal to the brain, or a message to the brain, that I can't handle this in the moment. So I hope that puts some good perspectives in. Nathan says, if I was financially secure, I could put up with having OCD for the rest of my life if I had to. I wonder, Nathan, if that maybe means like in regards to getting treatment, because I know that can be a tricky avenue to navigate through, right? Getting affordable treatment is very challenging and a lot harder than it should be. And, there's individuals, opportunities, sliding scale, things like that, but you do have to look quite a bit. And I would say each and every individual here, don't ever give up on advocating for yourself for appropriate level of care, because it's out there. So please keep that in mind. And when OCD affects academics, I think, it's similar with really any form of rumination, whether it's academics or engaging in a sport, or just trying to engage in friendships, relationships, right? OCD impacts your ability to be present in those moments. And so for me, I think it's really good to have that catchphrase that just means something to you, that you can remind yourself of to continue down the path of leaning into an exposure, right? And for me, usually if I'm distracted, it's because I'm trying to solve something. I'm trying to convince myself that I can get certainty for something that I'm triggered about, when I know that that's a slippery, dark slope. So if I can catch myself doing that, I remind myself, if I continue down this route, I'm going to miss more of this conversation. If I continue down this route, I'm going to be further away from the clarity that I need, more triggered, and just reminding myself of what the long term of that behavior is to bring myself back, right? So that can be something helpful. But at first, you might have to remind yourself over and over of, oh, shoot, that intrusive thought got in the way again. And this is the 10th time I've had to remind myself. But think about it. You can't expect yourself to engage in an exposure effectively the first time and be amazing at it. It takes some time, right? Like we have to work on moving a little bit at a time through certain exposures, and expect that it's not going to be a one-hit wonder where we're all going to do better. Oftentimes people will say, well, I did the exposure, but I'm still anxious. Why is that? I don't understand. And, they'll come in and they'll be upset because they feel like they failed. They did the exposure, but they were anxious and they feel like they failed. But in reality, that's not failing, right? Like that's totally the opposite, because we expect the behavior to change before the feeling follows. So it might take doing an exposure 3, 4, or 5 times before they get to a place where they really start to feel that anxiety lower. But it's still a total win if they successfully do the exposure, right? Even if they're feeling anxious, because before they were avoiding the exposure, or before they were feeling anxious and doing a compulsion. So I think I would say, recognize those half steps, that those are just as important as the full steps of, yeah, I did a great exposure and I didn't even feel anxious. Well, if you did it the first time and you didn't feel anxious, it's probably not the right exposure anyways. Matt, thanks so much for joining us. I'm glad you could jump in and get some great questions. Any tips on just right OCD? No underlying fear, just the need to feel right in everything. Yeah, great question, Simon. With just right OCD, sometimes there can't be an underlying, or there can not be an underlying core fear, right? I just have to do this thing and then I'll feel better. Sometimes there can be just, I just have to do this and I don't want to feel anxious. Sometimes it can be more tied to perfectionism of, yeah, I like these things to be ordered and arranged, and it just makes me feel like I can achieve and I can succeed and do better that way. But all can be equally detrimental, right? If someone struggles with severe perfectionism or a lot of just right behaviors, it can still get in the way. And so I think it's important to recognize if you feel this urge, like if first the environments that you know where the just right behaviors are, right? So is it when you're doing laundry that you get stuck in these just right moments? Or is it when you're putting away dishes? Or is it when you're turning off a light switch? Like, where are you doing these just right behaviors? And then set a goal for yourself to move one step closer to where you were before, right? If it's needing to put away a piece of clothing with a wrinkle in it, or a little bit at a time, just always setting that goal and don't backtrack. So that's another tricky part is, and a therapist might put on your homework to do a specific exposure, and you might do it successfully for that week, and then the next week you're going to have a new exposure, right? Because that old one you've done so well with. And sometimes we can go back to one of those old patterns or old behaviors of, well, that's not on my homework anymore, so I'm going to go back to doing that compulsion. And I think it's really important to remember that we want to keep consistency. So to give an example, Simon, I had a lot of like magical thinking, just right behaviors when I played in my sport. And even to this day, if I am about to go race, I have to tell myself before lining up to the starting line, you're tying your shoes 2 times, and that's going to be a double knot, and then you're done, right? And because I have this sticky brain sensation that comes up when I have high stakes stress around race time. And in the past, I couldn't tie my own shoes before races because I was doing it over and over and couldn't get it just right. And so now I have to have that plan set in place ahead of time so that I can work through this and not go back to an old pattern. So I would say keep that plan in place, especially if it's become more of a habit, right? Like if this just right behavior is more of a habit, not really tied to anxiety anymore, or anxiety as much, it's important to be able to recognize the habit. Otherwise, we kind of just go on autopilot. All right. Love the comments. Glad you guys are chatting with each other and supporting. I think that's so important. The thought of losing my job is a huge trigger. Yeah, definitely. And I would say, sometimes with jobs, an individual, or let's just say with school, right? Like an individual might ask for a 504 plan for their OCD. And I think it's important to, if it's OCD specific, now there can be other comorbid diagnosis that this comment would not apply to you for, but if a temporary accommodation is needed and you're actively working on an exposure to get through this moment, then I think that there's something to say about that, right? Because, for example, if someone came into treatment the first day and I said, you got to come into my office, kind of back with the opening the door example, right? And if I expect them to open all the doors and they haven't opened a door in 5 years, well, that's not going to be effective for this individual, right? That's going to be really hard, really challenging. We're going to trigger them before we even get started with exposure therapy. So an accommodation might be that I open doors for them the first so many sessions, but our long-term goal is for them to be able to open the doors themselves. And so that's why I wouldn't say with OCD specific, and I hope you guys are hearing this, that a comorbid diagnosis can make this not applicable, but with an OCD specific diagnosis where someone is actively engaging in treatment, we do want these accommodations to be temporary, not something that's long-term, because the goal is to work towards freedom from those different, struggles. So let's see here. There's ups and downs for sure. Absolutely. Let's see. OCD makes me doubt even the treatment. Like, what if the treatment doesn't work? Yeah, I think anyone in ERP therapy can say, TK, that they have doubted that at some point, right? especially when you've been completely debilitated and you've lost stuff to OCD. Just as, we were talking about the fear Corey had of losing their job. If you asked anyone in treatment, I think they would say that fear's crossed their mind, but it's when we live in that fear that it holds us back, right? So for example, if I lived in the fear when I was debilitated by my OCD that this treatment's not going to work, I'm not going to get better, why would I show up, right? I was asked to do really scary things that I had been avoiding for so long. If I had full belief that the treatment wouldn't work, there'd be no reason for me to go to it, and I would still be sitting in complete debilitation today, right? It is not a bad thing to have the thought, the curiosity that what if treatment doesn't work? What's a bad thing is to sit in that, right? Because sitting in that with certainty is only going to prevent you from moving towards your goals. So you can have that thought, you can have that fear, but we can't sit in that worst case scenario, even with a thought like that. We have to take it one day at a time. If my therapist told me, oh yeah, one day you're going to do this exposure, and it was like the highest exposure on my list of anxieties, if I would just think about that exposure every single day, it'd be really hard for me to go to therapy, right? And so I got the answer that I needed, and we're taking this one day at a time, right? Like I remember being debilitated, going home for Christmas break and thinking there's no way I can go back to school when I was in college that next semester with how debilitated I am right now. And if I just sat in that fear, all I would do is make myself panic even more than I already was all day, every day. And so I had to just say, okay, what can I do today? What can I do today to get one step closer than where I was last time? Because that alone helps get you to where you need to be. None of us think about everything we have to accomplish over the course of the next month, right? Like, oh, I have to brush my teeth 3 times or 2 times however many days. I have to make sure that I pick up the dry cleaning this many times. And then the list would go on, roll out the door, right? How long that list would be. We don't put that expectation on ourselves with our day-to-day tasks each month. And we still get those things done without having that extra long list. So why would we put that expectation on ourselves when it comes to our OCD treatment? And some may be really debilitated by OCD. And I'm not saying that list is there, but there's things that you are doing, even debilitated by OCD, that you're not thinking of a month at a time, that long 100-piece list 1 month at a time. You're capable of thinking of things one day at a time, and just look at that as evidence to stay motivated. What else? These are great questions. Keep them coming. Nathan says he participates in a CBT group. Excellent, Nathan. Cognitive behavioral therapy, just a plug here. For OCD, we really need that exposure with response prevention piece in there too. So that might be something that you're already doing, Nathan. Just for anyone listening, that's something I would love to plug in. You want to have some exposure work tied into that, because CBT alone for OCD can sometimes be, it's a phenomenal resource. There's a lot of good for it, but for OCD alone, it can sometimes be used as a form of reassurance if we're not engaging in it correctly. Cash said, my academics were being unable to turn pages of books without having the right thought, right amount of times, took minutes to turn one page. Yeah. I bet there's a lot out there that can lean into that as well, or relate to that as well, Cash, that either it's that just right feeling or that fear of something bad happening. So thanks for sharing. We have Bridget, who said, I recently was extremely judged at my job for learning style and then fired. My OCD was being triggered constantly, but I think they were discriminating, being overly critical. It kind of messed with my head. Yeah, tricky, terrible things can happen on the day-to-day that have nothing to do with OCD. And sometimes our OCD can attach to that and make it even messier. So, I think it's important to have those senses of support that speak truth to you, because remember, if OCD is making your anxiety heightened, it's a lot harder to think rationally about other things too, right? I always use the example, if I'm triggered very severely with OCD in the moment and I go to a restaurant and someone tells me to order something off a menu, it's going to be really hard to even make a choice like that, ordering something off of a menu, if I'm stuck in an OCD thought. So I think that's a great piece of information. Any tips on if I have successfully helped myself with OCD after years of hard work, but I feel completely empty and exhausted after expending such a tremendous effort? Yeah, and I would say, there are moments and ups and downs with OCD work. To put in perspective, I kind of had an aha moment not too long ago where something happened and I got really, really triggered. And I was thinking to myself, gosh, I'm an OCD provider right now. And I got this triggered. This is really bad. Why would I get triggered like this? And I thought, gosh, am I going to have to, do something more intensive? And in reality, the work that I had put in when I slowed down, took a breather, and recognized what exposures I needed to do, the response came back way quicker than it did the first time around when I first got my diagnosis, right? So I had 2 or 3 days where I was really triggered, but then within the week I was back where I was. And I think sometimes people think I'm starting all over every time I get exhausted or feel more triggered than I did the last time. And the reality is, even in some of those therapies that you were doing before for your OCD, you were building tools and skills that you maybe didn't realize you had, or maybe you don't realize you have now. And I think it's just important to have that accountability, because if you're leaning into the core fear, when you're doing exposure work, when you're leaning into uncertainty, when you're facing those fears instead of leaning away from them and avoiding them, then there should be a point where it's not as hard. And I think there's so many other aspects that have to do with that, right? So if, for example, we don't recognize the steps that we're taking, right? Like if someone comes in and they're struggling with intrusive thoughts, and they always ask for reassurance because of these intrusive thoughts, and we set some homework for them to not ask as much reassurance, and they come in the next session and they say, yeah, I asked 5 less reassurance questions, but I still asked a lot of reassurance, and they don't see that as a win. Why would that be something that motivates them to keep pushing through the exposures, right? It wouldn't. I think it is so important to recognize the half steps, because if we can see those, then it motivates us to keep pushing in each and every way. So recognize those half steps, recognize the tools that you have, even if in a moment you respond a little bit differently than you did before, right? Even if it's that you used to see something that triggered you and you would gasp every time and you no longer gasp. That is a huge step in the right direction. And we need those, I guess I'll call them gold nuggets, to keep being able to plug in and move forward and continue to do our best going forward. There is a lot of information, Corey, on ICBT for OCD on the IOCDF website too. And I think we've done some virtual conferences and webinars. So there's some good content out there. And we know that the CBT with OCD and ERP, there's all so much benefit coming from these. But I think at the root, just making sure that you're still at that core, leaning into some uncertainty. But I'll ask you to dive into that research a little bit more. There's great content on the website to help you answer. So when you say don't accept worst case scenario, do you mean not to engage with it as a possibility? OCD is ego dystonic, so we know in a way that's not who we are. Just trying to apply this. Excellent. Yeah, great question, Kate. So we do know that OCD is ego dystonic, meaning we have some rationale already tied to the intrusive thoughts about what they mean and what they don't mean. And so it doesn't mean, like when we say don't accept the worst case scenario, it doesn't mean that we have to ignore it, right? Because if we try to ignore, I'm not a bad person, I'm not a bad person, I'm not a bad person, then it's just going to come on stronger, right? It's just going to get in our face. And so it's more like, oh, yeah, I acknowledge that. But if we're accepting, we're still going to a place of certainty. And certainty always follows up with more compulsions. And so I like to picture it like I draw 2 lines on a paper for some clients, right? And I'll have 100% certainty that this horrible thing did happen, 100% certainty that this horrible thing didn't happen. And then we've got these tiny, tiny lines that you have to stand on. But in the middle, we have this huge range of uncertainty, right? If you're going what most people with OCD either stick with one, right? Like, no, I have to reassure myself that I'm this great person over and over, or they stick with the other of, gosh, I'm such a bad person, or they pinball back and forth to the two. But there's this huge space in the middle to lean into that uncertainty piece, right? And so I wouldn't say it's good to ignore the bad person or whatever that 100% certainty thought may be. It's good to acknowledge it, but then try to just remind yourself, yeah, I'm not going to a claim. I'm not going to a specific title, because that's leading us down a slippery slope. And if that still doesn't answer your question, Kate, feel free to put another one and I'll try to get to that next. Let's see here. I'm going to go back to our live stream. I see these are some great comments that you guys have in here. Our questions from last time. So we have, why is OCD so bad when I'm trying to sleep? And I think a lot of people can actually relate to that, right? Because we lay down, we have a moment of peace and quiet, and then the thoughts just start spinning again. And so, you know, we talked about this in the virtual conference about how we often use distraction in moments when we have peace and quiet so that we don't have to think about that scary thought again. And it's challenging because if, you know, every time I start to get anxious, I pick up my phone and I start scrolling, I'm telling my brain again, you can't sit with discomfort. You can't handle it. You've got to distract yourself, when in reality, I need to be teaching my brain that I can handle it. And so, you know, if you're sitting in bed and your mind is wandering, what I've found just in general, this is just a sleep technique here, is that it, you know, for me, I get up, I get a drink of water, and then I go lay back down, and then it kind of resets the environment for me. But again, this is true to all OCD work. If you're trying to solve something, if you're trying to figure out an intrusive thought, you're going to continue sitting in that cycle of rumination, and it's going to stay hard for you to sleep. And so find that way that you can remind yourself that the more I try to get certainty, the more uncertain I become, and let that stick. Also, you know, some individuals, it might be more tied to just, oh, I have so much to do tomorrow. And with that kind of stuff, like if you're making lists in your head or thinking you're overwhelmed about the day that you have, then I would say some good nighttime relax routines could be helpful in that kind of situation. And for my OCD, my fear is being sexual orientation OCD. And I don't think I am. So when I have these thoughts or feelings that contradict this, I can be like, okay, there's that thought, there's that feeling, and I don't have to engage in it. Yep. Kate, that was very well said. There's that thought, there's that interesting thought, and I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm not going to solve it, and I'm going to go forward with my day. The secret to a lot of OCD treatment is we get more clarity when we stop trying to get clarity. So when we're trying to get clarity, we're pushing ourselves away from that. It gets more confusing and challenging. Next question is, how do I turn off the brain's alarm system? Even though I expose myself to a fear and anxiety, that way I don't make myself feel miserable. So with the alarm system, what happens, especially when we have these physical aspects that come with it too, right? So if something's triggering and you go, we're setting more of an alarm, or if something's triggering and we run away from that situation. Now, if it's a dangerous situation, that's a little bit different. We want that fight or flight response to help, right? It's gotten us out of those dangerous situations. But when it comes to OCD, if we're triggered by an OCD thought or contamination or, just right behavior, and we escape or we get away, we're only making that brain's alarm higher, right? Or stronger, because we're saying this is bad, and this is bad. And every time I'm around this thing, I have to have that brain alarm go off. And so instead what we do, when I said this a few times earlier, I realized I didn't explain it, but when we change the behavior and the feeling follows after, we often get that switched around. We often think we have to change the feeling and then we can do the behavior, right? So when I stop feeling anxious, then I'll go to the store. When I stop feeling anxious, then I'll apply for that job. When I stop feeling anxious, then I will text my friend, right? But again, what we need to do to stop feeling anxious is actually face the behavior, right? And that might look different for everybody, right? If someone's debilitated by OCD, it might not make sense to just go jump into a job, but it would make sense for them to have a step-by-step approach to being able to get there if that's something they want to do long-term. And so that alarm system doesn't automatically go away. Sometimes it can temporarily if you're doing a compulsion, but it just starts to get a little bit quieter and a little bit quieter and a little bit quieter. I remember doing an exposure one of the first times and thinking, okay, so with my driving down the road and fearing that I hit someone and have to go back and check, just there was one day where I realized, wow, I made it the whole way and I didn't look back. But the whole time I was doing that exposure, I didn't realize that I wasn't getting triggered, right? It was kind of just like, because the reason that is there isn't an automatic drop from the signal, right? There isn't this, oh, I feel so much better now and that OCD is not there. It's slow. And so by the time we actually recognize, oh my goodness, I wasn't triggered, it's because you've done quite a bit of exposure work to get there. So I hope that answers the signaling situation. Let's see. Sarah said, I broke up with my boyfriend recently and was struggling with if I did the right thing or not, and find myself wanting to reassure myself that I did the right thing. But obviously, I'm assuming that doesn't need to be answered because it could be a worry thought. Yeah, this is a tricky one, the relationship OCD stuff, right? But just with any thought, if we're trying to get certainty about whether we did the right thing or not, we're getting more uncertain, Sarah. So I think being able to lean into values and support of trying to honor that initial decision and moving forward, and then later getting that clarity is probably a better bet instead of trying to solve for clarity when you're feeling really heightened, really anxious. And let's see. Great comments, guys. Sorry if I'm skipping some. I'm just trying to get through to the questions because we only have a little bit of time left. Wow, this flew by. This is a good one. Can you talk about overcoming OCD when it has teamed up with PTSD? I lost my home to toxic mold and had a minor OCD tendency prior, but now have some severe contamination OCD. Yeah, so OCD can definitely get messy when it teams up with PTSD or any other diagnosis for that matter. I think it's helpful to have a provider that understands trauma along with the OCD work, even if it's, some cognitive processing techniques, so CPT, cognitive processing therapy, or, it depends on the individual. Obviously, it's different for everyone. But if someone hasn't addressed the trauma, or they don't really know that the trauma is there and they're working on exposures for the OCD, this is from personal experience, that might not get better, right? Because you're doing this exposure, you're treating it like an OCD exposure when maybe there's really this trauma that you have to unfold, or even just be able to recognize, that's a trauma response. When I was personally able to do that, I was able to untangle that piece, and then the exposure work started working. So the formula can look a little different. And again, there's not a one size fits all, but I think with trauma therapy, there's some prolonged exposure work someone can do too. But again, the exposures look a little bit different when it comes to PTSD. But I think it's so important to address both, whether that be that you have a provider for the trauma and then you work on the OCD, or your providers collaborate together, or you have a provider that specializes in working with both. All right, I think we have time for one more question, and we will, if I didn't get to yours, we will put that in the post for the ones that weren't asked last live stream. This is so fun. You guys are all incredible, and I'm so glad you're here. And thanks for joining me, even though I'm not the usual live streamer here. It's incredible to be able to support and advocate in this way. So let's say Betsy says, I have a safety word that I use when I'm anxious. I want to stop using it because it's become a compulsion. How do I stop? Yeah, Betsy, that's a great point, because sometimes we can have like a temporary thing that we do that's not a compulsion originally, but then it can become a compulsion, right? So for example, some individuals might give themselves worry time, where, maybe they're ruminating all day and they'll say, okay, I'm going to give myself 15 minutes to ruminate at 6 p.m. and I'm going to push that rumination until then so that I can engage in my day and I can ruminate all I want during that 15 minutes. But then let's say they start doing better, they're functioning more, and they leave that 15 minutes there. Well, then the opposite, the reverse can start to happen, is they're really just engaging in this big, huge compulsion that whole time, and they really rely on that. So it's important that we start to eliminate that when it's no longer needed, right? Just like it's important to move up to a higher exposure when it's time to move up to a higher exposure. And so I think there's so many ways that you can step up this exposure hierarchy approach. Maybe it's a little bit at a time. You start spelling a part of the word, right? And that's going to feel uncomfortable. I think it's important to know we do want it to feel uncomfortable if it's a true exposure, or just saying half the word, and then slowly starting to get to a place where you're not saying it anymore. That approach can look differently for everyone. You might go at a faster, slower pace, and that's where it's really important to work with a provider to get the best plan for you. But yeah, I hope that helps, Betsy. Thanks so much for your question. And I love your comment, Nathan. I appreciate that. Yeah, I love Ask the Experts. It's so much fun. False memory OCD for Braniel just joining. One of my favorite videos with Mark Freeman is the banana false. If you literally go to YouTube and you type banana false memory, you will see this really good content video. So check that out. I really, really appreciate this, guys. And let me just close us out with a final word, and then I'll send you all on your way. So some announcements. Did you know the online OCD conference content is available for 60 days after the conference? It's not too late to experience this, and you can go to Online OCD Con by visiting the iocdf.org website /online OCD Con for more. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The live stream that we did today is one of many. So you can see the entire schedule of future live streams at iocdf.org/livestreams. You can also view recordings of past live streams, as well as watch our host answer your pre-submitted questions on OCD Mailbag on IOCDF's YouTube channel. So youtube.com/IOCDF. Remember to like and subscribe to get notified when live streams are scheduled. Sign up for our IOCDF news and updates at iocdf.org/sign-up. If you need resources or are looking for a therapist, please visit iocdf.org, and you can search for a therapist in your area. Our next upcoming streams are Tuesday, November 7th, we have the town hall. And then on Wednesday, November 8th, we have the research roundtable. So please keep coming, guys. It was so fun. Thanks for joining me, and we will see you next time.